I've always found this comment curious. Apple was better when Steve Jobs was around. And honestly, maybe that's true, or maybe it isn't. Because when people say that, they usually mean one thing: Apple stopped innovating. And sure, Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, the MacBook Air, and the iPad. He changed the world multiple times in a row, but then Tim Cook comes in and turns Apple from a $350 billion company into one worth nearly $4 trillion, the first trillion-dollar company on Earth, one of the most valuable businesses in human history. So, did Tim Cook ruin Apple, or did he simply turn it into something else? Steve Jobs was a visionary, a legendary founder, but Tim Cook did something different. He turned Apple into a money printing machine. In fact, he's probably the CEO who has created the most corporate value in modern history. And it's not like Apple stopped investing in innovation. During the Jobs era, Apple spent around $2.5 billion a year on research and development. Tim Cook pushed that to more than $34 billion annually, more than 10 times higher. The problem is that Cook's innovation doesn't feel as glamorous because Jobs launched entirely new products. Cook optimized the empire, and optimization doesn't create the same excitement. The popular narrative is Apple stopped innovating, but that's not entirely true either. Take AirPods, for example. Apple basically created the modern premium wireless earbuds category. Today, it's a massive business, tens of billions of dollars. And beyond that, Apple dominates entire product categories. AirPods dominate premium audio. The Apple Watch dominates wearables. The iPhone is still the best-selling smartphone in the world. And years ago, people thought that would be impossible. Everyone said, Android will crush the iPhone because it's cheaper. That never happened. Now, a huge part of Apple's growth didn't come directly from innovation, and this is where things get interesting. Stock buybacks. Apple has repurchased more than $700 billion of its own stock. What does that mean? Imagine stocks are like money bills. If fewer bills are circulating, each one becomes more valuable. That artificially pushes the stock price higher. And Apple did this aggressively because it generates absurd amounts of cash. But there was another factor too. After the pandemic and during the AI boom, investors started valuing tech companies much more aggressively. The famous price-to-earnings ratio. Before, Apple traded at relatively normal multiples. Now the market pays dramatically more for every dollar Apple earns. So a huge part of Apple's growth wasn't just product innovation, it was financial engineering and market hype. This was probably Tim Cook's biggest strategic move: services. Apple stopped being just a hardware company. Now it makes absurd amounts of money from iCloud, Apple TV, Apple Music, the App Store, subscriptions, and commercial partnerships. For example, Google pays Apple around $20 billion every year just to remain the default search engine on the iPhone. $20 billion for default placement. And on top of that, Apple takes a cut from almost everything happening inside the iPhone ecosystem. Those margins are massive because software and services are far more profitable than manufacturing hardware. The problem is, regulators are starting to attack that business model. Europe, China, lawsuits like Epic Games, everyone is trying to weaken the App Store monopoly. The most important innovation of the Cook era wasn't the Vision Pro, it was Apple Silicon, the M1, M2, M3 chips. That completely changed the industry. Apple went from depending on Intel to building its own processors. And not only are they good, they're ridiculously efficient. Better battery life, less heat, more power, and Apple controls everything. Hardware, software, architecture, integration. That's why modern Windows laptops often feel behind compared to a MacBook. Apple literally redefined portable computing. And this is where Apple's real problem begins. Apple arrived late to AI, very late. Apple Intelligence felt strange. The announcement sounded impressive, but once it launched, people just weren't blown away. Siri is still far behind OpenAI, Gemini, or Claude. And according to multiple reports, Apple even had to send internal teams to AI boot camps just to catch up. That's wild for a company like Apple, especially because Apple actually has one incredible advantage: its chips, now. The Vision Pro was probably Apple's biggest visible failure in years, and honestly, it feels like a product born out of fear. Fear of missing the metaverse hype. Meta changes its name. Zuckerberg goes all in, pandemic, remote work, VR, and Apple responds, "We need to launch something." The problem is that Vision Pro is insanely expensive, and it doesn't solve a real problem. Yes, technically, it's impressive, But that doesn't mean there's a market for it, and selling 350,000 units for Apple is basically nothing. And then there's the Apple Car. Supposedly, Apple spent around $10 billion only to cancel the entire project. Nothing, no product, no car. Internally, some people even compared it to the Titanic, and that proves something important. Even Apple can fail spectacularly. Now we get to the philosophical issue. Apple dominates the classic interface, the smartphone. But what happens if the future no longer has interfaces? What if we simply talk to AI? Because if computing becomes conversational, then the operating system changes completely. And that's where Apple has a problem. It doesn't have strong foundational AI models. Google does, OpenAI does, Anthropic does, Apple doesn't. And in fact, everything points toward Apple eventually depending on external models like Gemini. That's massive, because historically Apple always wanted to control everything. The real answer is, Tim Cook was extraordinary, but he wasn't Steve Jobs. Jobs was a category-defining inventor. Cook was a world-class strategic and financial operator, and growing a company that already dominates the market is probably one of the hardest things in business. Tim Cook didn't destroy Apple. He turned it into the most profitable and valuable company on earth. But now comes the hard question. Can Apple continue being Apple? In a world where innovation no longer comes from hardware, but from artificial intelligence? Because for the first time in a very long time, it feels like Apple is no longer leading the future. And for Apple, that's completely new.